Hi, guys. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Beatrice Foreman, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. I am Democracy Day's project coordinator and also a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where I cover the creator economy, digital culture, and broadly speaking, how young people in Philly make money and community on the internet. I am also a young person myself. I am a recent college graduate and 22 years old, and always wish I was so much more politically active in college alongside my writing. So this panel means a ton to me. We're going to dive into the conversation in just a few minutes, but I wanted just to get started and set the table for us today. So obviously, this panel is about young people and the 2024 elections, which is important in and of itself. But this discussion is really about how to go beyond those stock stories that we see every year that always go a little something like, I can't believe young people had such good turnout. How did that happen? And those stories, that's a bastardization, of course, of some well-intentioned reporting. But those stories happen so often because journalists, for better or for worse, or for reasons outside of their control, kind of operate with this built-in belief that politics is a game for adults. Politics shouldn't be a game for anyone, but threats to democracy are especially not a game for young people because they impact us more acutely. We are thrust into situations and policies are thrust upon us without a lot of care for us or, ask about what if we would want this. I mean, like, hello, student loan debt. So because of that, and because these issues affect us so much more acutely, we can be really good at direct action and organizing that works. Case in point, the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, which is a group of college and high school students, is so good at lobbying and policy change in Georgia. They prevented a major county from getting gerrymandered to high hell. They advocate for tons of funding for public education and actively prevent transphobic bills being passed in the state Senate. And they get tons of and they get a lot of coverage in the media, but it's always kind of wondrous when in reality this stuff is happening all across the country. On Democracy Day, September 15th, students in Arizona are organizing not one but two climate justice marches, and in Philadelphia, where I'm from, young people are routinely unionizing their workplaces and calling on the city's largest university, my alma mater, UPenn, to divest from fossil fuels and make payments to fund public education in the city. So all that is to say, journalism that takes into account that young people can remain informed and engaged without necessarily interacting with traditional news sources will, as you guess, make them more likely to interact with traditional news sources. I'm not going to bother you with all the research that confirms what we already know. Young people are more disillusioned than ever with institutions of power for good reason. But as that relates to journalism, I'm going to point to some research from the Center for Information and Research on Civic Engagement and Learning at Tufts University on why Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't really trust traditional news sources. A recent white paper of theirs goes into how it's because journalists don't really speak to young people or let them speak for themselves. And if we partnered with young people as co-creators of news, we would actually create more journalism that's authentic and representative and meaningful to a diversity of youth. All that to say, this discussion is about why it matters to engage with young people early and what can be gained beyond those conversations, beyond just a laundry list of issues that matter to Gen Z. So I'm excited to be joined today by a slate of speakers who empower young people of all ages and stripes to tell their own stories, and also a young person who isn't me, who can talk about their experience at the nexus of student organizing and professional journalism. So now let me rattle off these speaker bios. First up is Allegra Kirkland, who is the politics director at Teen Vogue. She previously worked at Talking Points Memo as a reporter covering voting rights and extremism and as a senior editor. Lexi McMenamin is the news and politics editor at Teen Vogue. They are also a co-organizer of the Zenith Cooperative, coordinating a mentorship program for early career journalists of marginalized backgrounds. They have been published by the BBC, New York Magazine, them.com, the New Republic, and elsewhere. Dylan Bernard is a cultural strategist and advisor to purpose-driven brands and organizations who serves as an advisory board member of U.S. Democracy Day. He is the director of communications at Future Coalition, a national network for youth-led organizations and youth organizers. He created the Webby Award-winning series Young People Address the Nation, home to the historic youth response to State of the Union. And last but not least is Mira Sadao, a senior at the University of Pennsylvania, where she runs the Disorientation Guide, a publication that educates students about systems of oppression at Penn. She has been published in the Nation, Vice, Teen Vogue, and more, and she currently works as a democracy production intern at CNN. What Mira's bio did not tell you is that she is one of the first reporters I ever edited at Penn, and she is a brilliant student organizer who has had a role in so many powerful student-driven campaigns at Penn. So she's a talented writer, but she's also a talented organizer. So with that, I'm gonna throw this first question to everyone. Oh, wait, rules of the road. Questions are welcome during this panel. If you have one, type it in the chat, and at the end of our conversation, we will get to those questions first during our Q&A. So our first question for everybody on the panel is, how did your organizing experience, if any, as a young person, influence your relationship with media as a consumer or a storyteller? So yeah, who wants to go first?
Could jump in first. For me, I think the deeper I get into the organizing spaces, and much of my work through Future Coalition and others is really getting to support and work with other youth organizers. And then the more I get into that, the clearer that it becomes that there are so many grassroots movements led by young Black, Indigenous people of color that are just not covered in the mainstream. And for me, I think it comes down to the point that it's much more powerful to do this work when you're in community of folks you serve. So I think as I think through the intersection between the organizing work that I've done and relationship as a kind of storyteller and consumer, I really think so much of this comes down to really being able to work with the communities you're in service to on the dailies. Because I think for me, every day I get to work with the communities that I'm in service to and working with and collaborating with. And I think that same piece on the media end, I think there's a lot of more opportunities to do that. So for me, that's what I always take away of like, okay, when I've been in the media space, when I'm consuming media, I'm like, this doesn't quite match the vision that I'm hearing on the ground. And I think there's so much more there in terms of the story that we're telling, which just means, for me, I think it means getting more embedded with the youth organizers who are doing the day-to-day work. It means getting beyond that initial go-to speakers that folks go to. It means going deeper. So I think that's really often my challenge in this space.
What you see in the press talking about is really important. Lexi, what about you?
Yeah, I was a very active student organizer in undergrad, while I was also on the student paper, which I'm sure is a frequent path for people that end up going into covering this stuff. But at the time, I was told I was only allowed to work on the opinion pages because I was doing organizing work, and that I was too biased to do any of the news reporting for the student paper, which already was pretty hamstrung by like university funding and other good stuff. But it was a really great crash course in like kind of, as Dylan was speaking to, like all of the ways that things can get lost in communication or misrepresented, or like I think I was much more familiar with the organizers' perspective of like what are like the pros and cons of getting coverage of certain things. And then like before I ended up doing my work as a journalist and editor, which I actually found really helpful, but for a long time I had an impression that the journalism industry saw as like a strike against me, which is really interesting because I think that part of what my journalistic strengths include is like being able to build deeper relationships with organizers and have like a accountable relationship with the issue areas I cover that doesn't feel like it's completely tied up in I guess like a sort of archaic perspective on like what objectivity is and like what we owe our readers, I guess.
Yeah, I'd love to jump off what Lexi said. I'm a little bit older than they are, and I feel like when I, got into journalism in college, the guidance was very much like you can be an organizer or you can be a journalist, but like you cannot do both at the same time. And I sort of took that to heart, so I did not really come up with an organizing background. And I think it's been really gratifying and like wonderful to see in the last few years a bit of a reckoning with these concepts of objectivity, neutrality, of like people, journalists not supposed to ever, having had an opinion on anything in the entire world, and how ridiculous that is. Like all of us come to this work with our gender identity, our racial background, our organizing experience, whatever it may be, and that just informs our work and makes us better journalists. And I think being honest about like how we come to this work is much better than pretending like we are just these like empty vessels with no opinions or experience.
All right, last but not least, Mira.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything everyone said so far. And I also think that working on the disorientation guide at Penn has definitely opened my eyes to how many journalists who work on the student paper or who do like, very empirical news reporting are also interested in issues of social activism on campus, because, that's what they're exposed to every single day at their jobs on campus. And so then when there's this opportunity to contribute anonymously to an activist publication, they jump at it because that's what they've been wanting to write this whole time. And isn't, the kind of work that is available at the publication. And I'm also glad that you mentioned in your intro the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, because I think they've taught me a very important lesson, which is that storytelling is just a better organizing strategy. And so I think one of the reasons why they're so successful is because they host workshops and they focus their impact on telling young people how to articulate their story through town halls and media and things like that. And that way of organizing has actually been so much more efficient for them than relying solely on, these statistics or these financial connections, et cetera.
So I'm often curious about the relationship between press coverage and the success of movements. I took a ton of classes on it in college, on the Occupy Wall Street movement, on, organizing around like humanitarian organizing around the Rwandan genocide, and how just unsavory press coverage made it impossible for organizers to really do much. So my question for Mira and Dylan is, when you're acting in the role of the organizer, how have your interactions with the press kind of empowered or harmed the movement you belong to? I'm going to have Mira do this first if you're ready.
Yeah, sure. I think the toughest one for youth organizing is like when you feel like a journalist needs to like almost meet a quota in their article for like talking to a youth source about a given issue. So I think that's happened a lot where my friends have been like, hey, I got interviewed for this piece and it just got published, and they used like one of my quotes, and it just kind of feels like based on the conversation we had that they just needed someone to weigh in for the youth perspective and include that in a paragraph. And I think that that's probably the largest pattern that I've seen over the course of occupying both of these roles. And I think that, obviously everyone here recognizes that youth deserve their own story and not just, a footnote at the end of another. And that, when you're speaking to someone, if it's, a youth organizer that's being incorporated into a large article about a movement, how to have a conversation with them about being able to, highlight and give them a platform as well, instead of, just including them in a larger group of voices where they may want us to stand out.
Dylan, your turn.
Yes, and I think, so much of my work has been at the intersection of the youth vote and climate justice. That's kind of my two buckets of work that I kind of rotate in between. And particularly as I think through that intersection, my big thing as I think about press is ensuring that I'm not contributing as an organizer, as somebody who also supports other organizers in telling their narrative, to ensure that I'm not really supporting that narrative, or like there being one face of the climate justice movement or around the youth vote. So that's been my biggest thing, is this moment requires us to center the leaderfulness of our movements. And I often find that it's a little bit of a tussle sometimes to get reporters to really feature the wide array of voices. I get to work with organizers who are doing this work on the daily. They're in this grind. So there's a lot of opportunities to drill deeper, but I often get requests to can I talk to this specific person? And most times I'm like, yes. And there's actually several more folks I have in mind. So I think that's the biggest challenge that I've been really nailing down, is ensuring that there is some sort of intentional pushback to ensure that we're expanding who gets the amplification and gets that spotlight.
I have to say, when I'm doing reporting and a liaison for a movement organizing group tells me, yes, you can speak to this person and these other people, I'm always really grateful for it, because something you're supposed to ask of the reporter is, who else am I talking to? And if you answer that question, who else should I be talking to? Like, when you answer that question for me from the jump or preempt it, it makes me so much more excited to do my job. And it makes me so much more excited to see that you're interested in sharing in the storytelling aspect with me. But, of course, a lot of the pitfalls of journalism are systemic, especially in a time of layoffs, where constantly being asked to do more with less. So for Allegra and Lexi, I wanted to ask, what about, I think, the job of being a journalist, or just the pressures of existing in the industry and on deadline might make it tough to always cover movements in the way you might want them to?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one first. I think Dylan really got at a big piece of it, which is, I think the press has this unfortunate tendency towards hero narratives and just holding up one person as the face of the movement. Greta Thunberg is the face of the youth climate movement, when really people have been doing this work for years all over the world, and it's a huge disservice to the work they're doing. It puts way too much pressure on these individuals to speak for everyone's experience. So and another part of that is, I think it feeds into these youth savior narratives we see all the time of the young people are gonna save us, and mainstream media loves that shit, and it really absolves, I think, older people of their responsibility to also care about issues like the climate crisis and racial justice and gun violence and all the things that youth activists are fighting for, by just saying the youth are going to take care of this for us. And I think it's easier to just put one person on a magazine cover than it is to cover these movements over time in all their facets. So that's one thing I definitely see a lot of. And then I think another part of it goes back to that neutrality, objectivity, focus that I think a lot of more old school journalists, who are oftentimes the people running, more mainstream, larger newsrooms still, they still have that that's how they were taught. And so when younger journalists come into the newsroom and say, we should be doing more social justice coverage, why aren't we covering the fight, the war against trans rights or whatever, then they'll be told, you have an agenda, you have you're bringing some sort of bias into the newsroom, instead of just no, we're reporting on stories that are affecting people every single day. So those are the two things that come to mind.
Because Allegra and I share one brain, it's not, I don't know that I have too much to add on top of that. I will say, I have never gotten that response working with Allegra. So it is cool to be at an institution where I feel we really prioritize not feeding into the stuff that Allegra just said of trivializing social justice coverage into or trivializing it as a part of our work. But that, the only other thing I was going to bring up was kind of what you already gestured to, Beatrice, which was just the media and journalism industries being a disaster, and how that somehow sometimes impacts how we approach stories. For example, the Cop City, literally just this morning we're talking about the Stop Cop City movement, and so much goes on with that story, and then it becomes a question of okay, do I have bandwidth to cover it today? Do we have bandwidth to get a freelancer to cover it? What is our budget, like what are, like we have to like all of these things are important in our perspective, and like it is sometimes like frustrating to feel like all of the different moving pieces are just like an obstruction of doing the coverage that we want to do. But like, yeah, that's part of the gig right now, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think you touched on a really key point, is like this kind of like this constant feeling of overwhelm and futility around doing the work you're passionate about, but also kind of doing like the nuts and bolts of the job you feel called to do. And something I've personally found helpful, especially when reporting on young people, is like if a story that like I interview them for gets pushed a day or takes a little longer or something happens, I try to be as explanatory and honest with them as I can about that process, so they can learn how to interact with the media going forward, but also because like that is something that they're owed. And I think especially in Philly, when we are such like a labor and union town, it reminds people that like journalists are workers too, and just like how you face obstacles in your job, we do too. So then one of my other questions for everyone is, if you could pick your one pet peeve or the one thing you think like media just constantly gets wrong with covering young people, what is it? Like if there was one thing you want the journalists, the editors in the room to leave knowing they should not do that, what is it?
Say, assuming that, you know, because people might not be interested, young people might not be interested in electoral politics, that they aren't, you know, engaged in their communities and politically engaged. That is my biggest.
Okay. Mira, you seem like you have a lot to say.
I don't know if I have a lot to say. I have something to say. I think something that really bothers me is just kind of this general framing of like in exhaustion. Like young people are energized, we are excited and interested in doing the work, but also like, you know, writing every piece in this framework that's like there are these young energized young people and they're going to come in and they're going to work really hard and do everything, and then that's just the beginning. But the truth is that a lot of people are like really fucking tired, and I think it's also just important. That probably goes into like the kind of heroic young person narrative that you mentioned, Allegra, but just also being able to recognize that I don't know, this work is tiring and we need breaks, and no movement is going to be all you know, tireless work and wins.
Dylan, what's
Um,
your
Yeah, I think my biggest peeve is really around like the assumption that the youth vote kind of comes and then it magically like disappears, that there is no in between, there is no organizing in between. I think the framing I think is always interesting. And I say that with the context that I at Future Ocean and other organizations, I get to work with folks who are about long-term organizing and out organizing. I work with folks who are doing this work on the daily, who are really using elections as checkpoints. Like for example, Future Coalition in the last cycle, 2022, we paid over 1,500 students to knock on almost 90,000 doors and call 500,000 people. And then this year, we've been really focused around the storytelling and narrative and building the infrastructure for 2024. But just organizing in between all of these key checkpoints. And I think when we see like the narrative be like, young people showed up, I think that's missing the context that young people have and will continue to be showing up even using elections as a checkpoint. So I think the narrative, I think this, again, that leads me to the note around like there's so many stories in the in-between that I think are not being told. I think we're just kind of next year we're going to tell a bunch of youth vote stories, and then I think generally, and we're talking generalizations here, there's a mute. So that's kind of goes to one of my frustrations with the media.
All right, last but not least, Lexi, your chief frustration.
Lol. I mean, we've like covered a lot of them, which again, I'm not saying that to sound dumb, or like, you know, redundant. But I guess I had one too. Sorry, I'm trying to remember where it went. Yeah, I think kind of like what you were just speaking to, not just speaking to, but something else that you spoke to earlier, Beatrice, is like explaining to sources like what the process is, and like I think especially with covering young people and like their movements, they often like are I don't think I think it behooves journalists to like remember like the age a lot of the time of the people that they're interviewing, and like that they might not really completely understand the consequences of going public to the press, or like what being anonymous means, or like what having a pseudonym means, or like what their school can do legally, or like what libel law is, or just like all these other things that like you don't get explained to you necessarily in like middle school or whatever. I think especially with a lot of the like anti-LGBTQ sentiment going on, like obviously reporters want to talk to young people who are like moving states and stuff like that, and like how that's going to, whoop, sorry, I elbowed my printer, like how like electoral politics is going to be shaped by that sort of like rhetorical backlash and stuff like that. But since these are such sensitive dynamics, I think it only helps to the elbowing, thank you. Yeah, so hopefully that made sense. Sorry, I didn't mean to lose the thread there a little bit, but what I was
No,
trying to say is like it's a level of responsibility that I feel like it just comes from being empathetic and thoughtful. And
I mean,
think
you
there's
kind of like anticipated the next question, which is like for your one pet peeve that you listed, like what do you think is like the one solution to solving it? So in this case, you know, if you're like talking to young people and you're not explaining the process, you ought to be very clear about the consequences of the work that you do. So for Dylan, your pet peeve was people like ignoring the work that happens in between these big election years. What is the solution to not doing that anymore?
Yeah, and I think there's also the honest piece around like I found movements I sit in having a really tough time on documenting their work, and I think there's an added element to the thread we're following here around like being young people, which means different priorities, not necessarily having experiences with media. So I think there is, for me, I think putting some of the capacity things and the budgeting things aside for reporters, it really means having those active, to me, checkpoints with young people. It means actively calling on young people, to checking in with them. I think email. I think there's so many opportunities to really build a kind of a less transactional relationship. Not when I need a story, but like what is happening. I want to check in once a quarter with youth activists doing this work. I think there's some like low hanging fruit that can be done to start to get at that I think is just really building that relationship for when there is a story dripping, that you can kind of find it early too. So I think that's one, and I think for many, I think it can be a low-hanging fruit that can be implemented, if not already implemented, to more sources and potential sources.
And now, Mira, what do you think is the solution to reporters not kind of to not defaulting to that narrative of like young people are just always full of energy and we're just like jumping at the bit to change things 24/7?
Yeah, I think I mean one thing that most young organizers have in common is that they have like a million other things going on at the same time as this work. And so I think reserving some of that time in your conversation to talk to them about their life as, like a student or a full-time employee, or doing any number of things, serving as a caretaker, etc., that they're comfortable talking about, and being able to draw the contrast or the similarities between their work in organizing and their work just like living and existing every day, often just like makes this person seem a lot more real and grounded. And I also think as a young person who will like by a lot of people be like inherently disrespected and like disregarded in their mind, it makes them more of a whole human to interact with and respect. Not that they should need that, but that it still happens and sometimes it's necessary.
All right, and Allegra, what is your one solution to offer?
I guess I I would just boil it down to like hire more young journalists, hire more young journalists of color of all sorts of backgrounds, from all different parts of the country. And that's how you avoid having the same story that what kind that you alluded to earlier, Beatrice, of like, can you believe these young people like voted in big numbers, or like whatever, those kind of stories you read every election cycle, because you'll be getting story ideas from, you know, these people you hire will get them from their communities, their neighborhoods, their friends, their families, you know, their networks, and they're going to be much more interesting than just like the same thing you've read a million times. I also think it helps because I think young people are often more comfortable talking to journalists who are closer in age to them. Like, it's easier to relate to a peer than someone who's like your parents' age or like your teacher's age. So yeah, hire more young people.
All right, speaking of that and helping young people tell their stories and get more young reporters into the fold, I think Teen Vogue is like absolutely exemplary at doing that and giving opportunities for young people to not just also do reporting, but like do stuff that is that like kind of like makes them a part of the narrative in a way that like signals to the reader that like this is coming from a peer, it's coming from an expert. Like, for example, Delaney Mira and I's friend Delaney Parks got to do tons of participatory journalism and reporting on being a reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette strike paper and what it means to be in a union as a young person. So with that in mind, I don't want to tease or allude to too much, but Teen Vogue is going to be hiring some young people to do reporting in battleground states in 2024. So Allegra, I guess, can you tell me a little bit more about that program and what inspired you guys to do that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so we don't have like a cute, catchy name for it yet. We're just calling it the 2024 like Student Journalist Correspondent Project. But the basic idea is we are going to have students in like 7 of the key states that are going to kind of determine control of Congress and who ends up in the White House. So Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. And we're going to have one student in each state, sort of be like our eyes and ears on the ground for like what is going on in that state that matters, that is getting enough coverage, what are students on campus talking about, like what are people protesting at the state legislature, what crazy ballot initiative is actually like turning out voters in huge numbers, or scandals happening on campus or whatever. And yeah, the thinking was we wanted to hear directly from students about this stuff instead of like, you know, assigning out our version of the same stories that are appearing everywhere. We want this to come from them directly. And we just actually had our first meeting with them earlier today. They're a super amazing group. It was really hard to pick. Like, there were so many amazing candidates. But yeah, and some of the people we don't pick, we're like, please pitch us anyway. We'd love to work with you and have you freelance for us too. So.
That makes my heart so happy. And I guess, Lexi, my question for you is, what is the key to giving feedback to young reporters on their work, especially if they're making that transition or dipping their toe in journalism from like being a student organizer first?
Yeah, I guess like part of it is I think what I tend to rely on doing is like deferring to their expertise, right? Like recognizing that they have like, I think they can sometimes feel like intimidated or like insecure or like not even clear on like what information they should be sharing like with a journalist. And I think like there was other discussion of like, you know, thinking about like storytelling is like a thing that like both of us have to like kind of exercise in the situation, like a sort of relational kind of thing. So like I think that has been like one thing that I guess like recognizing like how we can make it as humane of a situation as possible from every situation in like journalism. And so like I think that's the one thing that I would like, it can feel a little like awkward and uncomfortable, but like it's a lot of the same skills that you use in organizing that end up making your interviewing processes like more respectful and like constructive, I think, a lot of the time. Like when you're like trying to like, I guess doing the opposite of what we talked about earlier up in this call, where people were like, oh, if you've done organizing work, you definitely can't be a journalist. I think I tend to try and like encourage younger people to embrace it as like a strength and like a thing that actually like bolsters their journalism work.
And now Mira is so humble, but Mira has had an illustrious freelancing career and was a member of the nation's student fellowship, and regularly contributes to a ton of places. So as a young person who is edited at the professional level often, what to you is like a good editor?
Thank you. I don't know about illustrious, but I'll take it. I think actually probably what I was gonna say when it comes to like editing young people, and stories about young people is probably what Lexi said a few questions ago, which is just really understanding that oftentimes the journalist and then also the sources you're working with are young and like need to know things like, you know, off the record, on the record, on background. Like they need to know, you know, what's going to happen at the school level or the state level, and you know, how to be safe and still be able to engage in telling their story. So I think people who recognize that, I mean, that's a really important quality in an editor and something I've always appreciated. I think something else that is a little bit trickier but still something I think is important is knowing what trajectory and what purpose you have for the story, but also being open to what the organizers believe are the most important facets of their movement. I've reported pieces where there are things that the organizers think are like extremely important, like you know, the demographics of their movement and like tensions that has caused. And I've had editors say, oh, that's a little too complicated for us to try to report now. And I think instead of having that feedback, it would have been better to have a sort of conversation about, okay, well, do we need to make this a longer project? Is there a way that we can still, you know, have this story be told and incorporated because it's something that's so important to the organizers? Or is this something that doesn't really align with this publication and what the editor's vision was for this piece? So I think also just being open to having conversations about what organizers see as the most important parts and conflicts of in their movement and versus what journalists see as being the most important elements. So because sometimes those are odds.
Yeah, I think a really good mindset to bring to editing always, but especially with young reporters or newer journalists, is editing is teaching. And that the feedback you give them should not just be specific to like the piece at hand, but stuff about how to make them better in the future and in the long run. From my experience serving briefly as an editor at a hyperlocal publication post-grad, is that when you don't want to work with a reporter again, how much of that is you not clearly communicating to them your expectations or like how they can be better, right? So it's just something to keep in mind is when you give feedback, especially to young people, that like these are skills you should hopefully want them to take with them in the future, right? So now a couple of rapid fire questions for the whole group. Is what is one thing you think journalists can learn from youth organizers and organizers in general about like relationship and trust building? Dylan, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think for me, I think the one thing I work exclusively in essentially decentralized movement spaces that are powered by, you know, hundreds of organizational partners that are also entirely intergenerational with, you know, adult allies really providing the infrastructure. And at the same time also being unified. So unified as possible, in terms of messaging or actions. So I think there's just a model here. There's a story there around just the intergenerational nature of a lot of these movements that I think is yet to be explored as much as it can be. And then two, I think it's just an interesting model of just the power of intergenerational collaborations that are unified while also being as decentralized as possible to, you know, start and maintain a movement. So I think there's a lot there around how movements show up for journalists and reporters to learn.
Lexi, what about you? What do you think journalists can learn from organizers about how to build trust?
Yeah, I also feel like I kind of skipped ahead with my previous answer and kind of like spoke to this a little bit too. So my bad. But yeah, I guess I think I've also been thinking a lot about like the role of accessibility as like a concept in my reporting, not to be like too meta, I guess, but like I think we all know that like there are certain ways that representation can be like negative, right? Or like something I've been thinking a lot about is like reporting on a campaign like too early in their organizing process and then like getting attention they weren't ready for, or like, you know, like the sort of like strategic questions that like obviously like in this moment, like we want everybody who wants to hold the mic to have the mic, and like we want it to be equitable and we want it to be safe for everybody. But I do think like being like asking a lot of like intermediary questions. I mean, this is a lot of stuff again that like other people have said in different formats and different answers to the questions, which is great that we're all like on the same page though. But like being in like a more like relational form of conversation as opposed to just like like and like even like teaching them little forms of professionalism I think can be good, but like also like feeding off their like urge to just be like direct and like not have a ton of like artifice around how we're talking about like what stories might look like, and like how they can all like how all of these different like structures interact with each other, like between like organizing communities and like youth communities and journalism and blah blah blah.
Mira, what do you think journalists can learn from organizers about building relationships?
I guess, okay, this probably comes from a different perspective, because I am a student who's not like fully employed in the journalism world and also a freelancer. But I do find that journalism as a job is a lot more individual than organizing. And so I think just learning of like, I don't know, just uninhibited collaboration and practicing writing collaboratively, even if you're not trying to publish collaborative writing, and, you know, just letting all competition fall to the side and recommend your friends to write stories and you know, give them sources and work with them, and it'll come back to you. And I don't know, I think that just that sense of collaboration and community is really important. And I don't know, at the freelance level and at like the collegiate level, I definitely still think like most of the journalistic world is defined by competition. But I don't know, hearing from voices like this also makes me think that that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, Allegra. Oh wow, that was yeah. I as a young journalist, I especially like a concentrated media market, I do want to say like competition is like generally, like you're right, competition is like the dominant vibe of the industry. But like as more people like us who have grown up understanding that like collaboration is important and getting through things together is important, that is less the case. So finally, Legra, what do you think that like what have you especially learned from organizers that like you take and carry with you as an editor?
I loved what Mira said, but also something that Dylan spoke to earlier is just being less transactional in our relationships with sources. I think is something that journalists can really learn a thing or two about. Like, don't just call people up after something horrible happens and hound them for a quote. Like, respect who they are as people, build those relationships out in advance so you actually like know the people that you're going to be covering. You know, if you're going to be covering a certain like movement all the time, get on the phone with the comms director and just like talk to them about what initiatives they're working on, you know, all that sort of thing. And reach out when you don't need something. So it's not just always like this one way kind of interaction, but instead like you show that you respect the work they do and you want to know about it, and yeah, just make it more of a two-way street.
Final question, and this is the rapid fire like answers to an icebreaker question. What in as little words it takes to communicate this, what do you think is like one of the top priorities for young people heading into the 2024 election? And I'm going to tokenize Mira for 10 seconds and ask her first because she's the resident youngest person. What do you think is the top issue for young people?
There's a lot. I think I'm going to answer this question with anything related to labor, because from where we're standing and looking out on the rest of our life, that's all we see.
All right, Dylan, I'm seeing you nodding in agreement. Do you think
Yeah,
that's
exactly. I hope this conversation in terms of what Gen Z cares about shifts to the economic issues as much as we care about the social issues. So that's my hope for those conversations.
All right, I'm just gonna zigzag backwards. Lexi, what do you think is a top issue among young people heading into 2024?
+1 to all of those things, but also just like being completely apathetic at best and furious at worst at the presidential election choices for next year, and how that like voter apathy will impact, or not yet, maybe not apathy, but as of right now might impact everything else that's going to happen.
All right, and Allegra, finally, agenda setting, I guess, for Teen Vote for 2024. What is one of the issues that you're seeing come up among young people heading into 2024?
Yeah, I can't pick just one, but I'll do climate and student debt, I think, are just the things we get so many pitches about, and I think are really going to inform how young people are looking at the Biden administration and sort of assessing this record next year.
All right, so we have about 12 minutes left for Q&A, and we had 4 questions in the chat. So the first 2 come from Annie Dance, who covers democracy and accountability in the Lake Lure area of Western North Carolina. Annie happens to have experience working on Republican campaigns in the Northeast, but I'm an unaffiliated voter. The first question is, when you say organizers, are you referring to Democratic groups? I think this is kind of targeted at the people on a Democracy Day who planned this panel and gathered all of you here today. And I don't think this is necessarily true, especially with the conversation we've had today. I think organizers means anybody working in a grassroots movement. And I think the conversation we had, I think especially true when you think of organizers and people in rural areas who are extra disaffected when it comes to coverage in the press and don't get covered at all, or get tokenized, or just don't necessarily have tons of interactions, let alone positive interactions with the media. So when we say organizers, I really mean anybody working in a grassroots movement, any young people working in a grassroots movement. Young Republican clubs are more than welcome to this party. Libertarian groups more than welcome. But that said, when we think about threats to democracy, I think it is pretty clear to see where the lion's share of those are coming from, and we do have to be mindful when we're not just talking about Democrats, is that those groups are also capable of being critical of those threats. But the second question is, how can we cover democracy without being polarizing? Is that even possible? Heavy question. And Allegra, as an editor who makes coverage decisions, do you think we can cover democracy without being polarizing?
Democracy is also toxic, but I would say just some things shouldn't be political. Everyone should be able to vote. That's not controversial. That, I don't know. So yeah, I think, I don't know. I think everything is polarizing now. So it's hard to do this, but I don't know. I think you sort of just have to operate from a place of certain things we should all agree on. People should have voting access, and voter suppression is bad, and certain fundamental, I'm thinking of the most basic democracy related concepts, but yeah, and then I think you should report on that as a given, no matter what application you are working for. So
yeah, I think jumping off of that, so much of the work we do at Democracy Day is telling people what kinds of stories are democracy reporting, and that you can really expand your definition with that. And I think to your question, Annie, covering the procedure of how things work, how polling workers do their jobs, how polling places are picked, how machines, vote tallying machines even work. That should not be polarizing at all. Same thing, democracy journalism is service journalism that tells people how to take advantage of their rights as people. So like stuff that's like, here's how to reach all of, you know, the new people in office next year. Like here's how to, you know, do, I don't know, public records requests. Like that's kind of boring, but like, you know, like service journalism that helps people take advantage of their rights also shouldn't be polarizing. Next question comes from Andrea CH. She said the framing of young folks as energetic leaves out exhaustion with leaves out the exhaustions the older generation is leaving with them. That was such an amazing point, Mira. My question is, how do you break the ice with organizers? I have been at protests and wary of interrupting the labor of leading the event. Is social media a good conversation space or invasive? So Dylan, like how do you how would you recommend somebody break the ice with organizers?
Yeah, I think definitely starting with social media as a way in, I think works. And then I think it really goes back to having that Zoom conversation. Particularly as I was entering the space, I think that's what I appreciated, is building those relationships, because I think I not only learned that as an organizer, and then as somebody who now heavily supports other organizers tell their narratives, was heavily just building that relationship with journalists. So I definitely think social media, then shifting over to email, and then having a conversation, and then, you know, talking actively. Like I think the big thing is just to do it with, and no need to overthink it in my eyes. Because I think folks would appreciate folks seeing them and collaborating with them in any capacity.
Yeah, Mira, do you have anything to add, like how especially because you operate kind of interchangeably between both sides of this kind of fold, how would you recommend people break the ice with organizers?
Yeah, I mean, I think just being able to catch someone after an event is always a good way to like just break the ice, get their contact information. I think if you're actually present at an event and then you go stalk someone on social media, especially if they have like a private account and it's like a personal account, then maybe it would have just been better for you to make first contact when you saw them. But that's definitely still a way to do it.
I use social media almost entirely for all of my news gathering. I slide into people's DMs, and I have to say, very, very rarely have people had a problem with it. People are actually often excited that like you even found them and you think their work is cool. But I do think when you send that initial DM, how you do it is really important. Telling them that it's okay for them to ignore it. It's okay for them to say no. It is okay for them to ask you questions about how you found them, or like the work. Make it like a very like, this is just an open space and you have total autonomy over what happens next, is really important if you're sliding into people's DMs over social media and doing a little bit of stalking. Jessel Noor, who's also one of the organizing members of Democracy Day, asked a very good question. 40% of US news consumers actively avoid the news, according to a new study. Evidence suggests that overly problem-focused reporting is fueling the trend. Do you find that young people don't just want to hear about like problems and all the shit that's terrible, but also want reporting that looks at like where progress is being made? Like, do you find that young people have an appetite for for solutions journalism? Lexi or Allegra, from kind of like the analytics and, you know, stuff you have at Teen Vogue, do you find that people, like your audience, is animated by like solutions oriented stories?
I can go, but if you want to go first, Allegra, no, okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated one that I think we expend a lot of energy trying to figure out. In my experience, we were talking about this earlier today, but one thing that is important to me is that like I, you know, keep in touch with my teenage family members and like my 20-something, early 20 people that are younger than me, big slew of information gatherers who are not all like media pilled. When we're thinking about what stories are likely to get, like we're coming from the perspective of service journalism kind of regardless, you know what I mean? Like, what is the most useful thing that a young person could use in this time? Like, is it an op-ed? Is it like a reported piece? Like, what is the thing that will like either not make them feel like catastrophically, you know, like, oh no, this terrible thing's happening and I have no power, but also like won't make them feel like it's at the other end of what we were talking about before of like, oh, like young people are saving the day. All they have to do is register to vote and then America's problems are saved. So I think like there's definitely an appetite for like servicey related journalism, but I think a lot of the more like negative journalism also just fails to like if you're a report, like as long as you acknowledge the organizing that's going on around a big bad thing, then like you're reporting it like optimistically and also honestly. But if you only report like the bad stuff and not the people that are actively resisting, then like I would understand feeling disengaged from that media approach too, I guess is my conclusion.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. That I think reporting that fundamentally focuses on organizing and movement-based journalism is solutions-based journalism, because you're covering the people trying to figure out the solution. Next question comes from Mariela Santos Muniz. She says, how can the media better cover youth organizers and young people in the US whose primary language isn't English? That is such a good question. What I will say from my experience editing in a hyperlocal publication is, if you're talking to a source that is organizing in bilingual ways, or their audience is mostly Spanish speaking or Mandarin speaking or whatever, you should probably publish and translate whatever you reported on in the language that makes it accessible for that core audience to read. And I know, like a certain media organization laid off the entire like Spanish speaking like staff pretty recently. Don't use AI to do that. Like translating English journalism into journalism in another language is a science, and it takes nuance, and it takes lots of work. Real people should do that. But for anybody else who wants to jump in and answer this question, go on and go forth.
I would just also say to have reporters that can report, do their own original reporting in that language, in addition to people who can serve for translation purposes, because obviously those stories are very different and also very important.
Yeah. All right. I think we have time for one or two other questions. If anybody wants to just hop on, just say them now.
I have one. I can jump in.
Okay, Joe.
Hi. Obviously,
Hi.
big fan of everything. The thing that drives me crazy the most is when I hear people, particularly traditional journalists, lamenting the lack of media literacy, in particular. And to me, it smacks of the terror of losing control of a narrative that they have had control of for so long. And I wondered what, particularly Allegra or Lexi, what do you see as a response to that is not just, shitting on them, but actually is a productive way to meet in the middle there? Because it seems to me that they're also pushing the responsibility onto news consumers to learn something and how to read and digest something that the media is putting out. Like, how do you find a middle ground there that is a productive, forward-facing solution without falling back on those same tropes all the time?
Yeah, we publish stories every day, and people seem to have no difficulties comprehending them. Like, it's not an issue. Yeah, I think some of this comes from like who their core readers are at some of the outlets that you might be referring to, Joe. Like, and they might not go to like, I'm not gonna name any specific publications, but like their homepage to get their news, but they might be finding it in other places. They might be finding it on social media, whatever. It doesn't mean they're like not consuming the news or don't understand what they're reading. It just means they might not be reading what you're putting out. So yeah, I think just not having this condescending attitude is a great way to is a great starting place. And then yeah, I mean, something we always try to do in our coverage is we never ever want to talk down to readers, but we also don't want to assume they know like everything about everything and like some policy proposal that's coming down from the White House or whatever. Like, so we explain, we add that context into the pieces in like a way that's sort of digestible, but never being like, you big dummies. Like, our readers are super smart and informed. So yeah, just that combination of context and not being condescending. Anything else?
Nice
also think-
one anyway. Go ahead.
I also think young people are just media literate in a different way than like old guard journalists realize. Like we are so good at determining what is an ad and what is being sold to us because all we consume are different types of sponsored content every day on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, right? That's a certain type of media literacy that respectfully, like I love my mom who's 54, she doesn't have that. She gets everything the algorithm recommends to her, right? And conversely, like we're also good at spotting like what might be a deep fake, what might not be authentic content. And those are things that newsrooms need to invest tons of resources into to fact check. Whereas someone like myself or Lexi or Mira or Dylan or even you or even anyone who grew up as like almost digital native or who is chronically online, we can kind of do that almost intrinsically, right? So like I just think there are different types of media literacy. And I think just saying young people are like media illiterate is just like a dumb, broad sweeping generalization that doesn't do much. Yeah, I'm very passionate about this, as you can see. I don't want to go too much over, but I wanted to thank everybody for attending. If you have any other questions that you didn't feel confident or comfortable to say, you can always email us. We can get you an answer. And you will also get a thank you exit email with a ton of goodies, including all of the resources Joe dropped in the chat today, but also a curated guide from myself and Mariella that's like a starter kit for reporting on youth organizers in 4 battleground states for 2024. So we've told you, how to do that, why you should do it. So if you're curious and want to hit the ground running, you will have the contact information for 2 youth organizers in these 4 states. To kind of get you started. So thank you guys so much. This was such a pleasure. Bye.
Thanks, Sal.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much. You'll get the recording and an email summary from me shortly.